I came to the bank on a completely ordinary Tuesday morning to ask for a $5,000 loan. But when the branch manager pulled up my file, he looked at his screen, then looked at me and asked, "Ma'am, you have exactly $43 million in your account. Why would you need a loan?" I had never seen that kind of money. I had lived modestly my entire life. But when I found out where the money came from and who had been stealing from me, everything changed. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm so glad you're here with me. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like this video. And let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way, I can see exactly how far my story has traveled. I never thought of myself as a woman who could be easily fooled. I spent 31 years teaching third grade at Millbrook Elementary in Dayton, Ohio. 31 years of watching children learn to read, to add, and to tell right from wrong. I knew instantly when a kid was lying about his homework. I knew when a little girl was hiding tears behind a brave smile. I thought I understood people. I was wrong about the ones closest to me. My husband, Daniel, was a quiet man. Not cold, just contained. The way certain rivers are deep and steady beneath a calm surface. We married young and built our life slowly, brick by brick. We lived in a small house on Carpenter Street with a front porch I loved and a rose garden that Daniel never quite managed to keep alive. He worked in finance his entire career. Nothing flashy, not Wall Street, just careful, methodical work at a regional investment firm. He never talked much about money at home. "The money takes care of itself," he used to tell me with a gentle smile, "as long as you leave it alone." I smiled back and let him handle everything. That was our arrangement, and it worked perfectly fine for 23 years. But when Daniel died of a sudden heart attack in March of 2016, I became a person I didn't recognize. Grief does that. It violently hollows you out and leaves behind a ghost who looks like you, but can't quite function like you. I forgot to eat. I forgot to pay the electric bill. I stood in the cereal aisle at Kroger for 15 minutes once, holding a box of Cheerios, completely unable to remember why I had driven to the store. That is exactly when Ronald and Cynthia stepped in. Ronald was Daniel's younger brother. He was louder, smoother, always armed with a firm handshake and a ready, brilliant smile. His wife, Cynthia, matched him perfectly. She was polished, manicured, and warm in that highly specific way that real estate agents and megachurch greeters are warm. They drove up from Columbus the week after the funeral, armed with heavy casseroles, deep condolences, and a very quiet suggestion. "Peggy, honey," Cynthia said gently, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table, patting my hand. "You are in absolutely no state to be dealing with complex finances right now. Let Ronald take a look at things. Just temporarily. Just to keep the lights on until you're back on your feet." I said yes. Of course I said yes. I was drowning in grief. Ronald had himself legally added as a co-manager on Daniel's primary investment and checking accounts. "Just administrative access," he explained smoothly, sliding a stack of dense, legal papers across my kitchen table with the ease of a man who had practiced the movement. I signed exactly where he pointed. I didn't read the fine print. I was 55 years old, my husband was dead, and I didn't read carefully. That is the one thing I will never fully forgive myself for. The years slowly passed. I eventually went back to teaching my third graders. I tended my garden. I learned how to be alone in a quiet house. Ronald and Cynthia called on birthdays and holidays. Sometimes they brought expensive wine when they visited. They always asked how I was doing with the performative, exaggerated concern of people who desperately needed to appear caring. I took it all at face value. Why wouldn't I? The very first crack in the illusion appeared 18 months ago. I had finally decided to update my legal will, something my best friend Carol had been gently nudging me about for years. I made an appointment with a straightforward estate lawyer named Patricia Howe. She asked me to bring in a complete summary of my assets. I went to Daniel's old desk and pulled out the thick folder he had kept, the one labeled Household Finances in his neat block letters. Inside were old account statements, insurance documents, and the deed to our house. I sat down to review them, and the numbers simply didn't add up. I am a third-grade teacher, not an accountant. But I knew what Daniel had told me we had saved. I knew roughly what our retirement was supposed to look like. What I saw in that folder was roughly 40% of what I expected to see. I told myself I had misremembered. I told myself the stock market had been rough. I told myself there was probably a perfectly simple explanation. But something small, cold, and hard settled deep in my chest, and it absolutely refused to leave. I started paying attention differently after that. Small things. Ronald's brand new $60,000 truck. The lavish vacation photos Cynthia constantly posted on Facebook. Tuscany, Barbados, a luxury ski lodge in Aspen. They had always been comfortable, yes, but this was something entirely else. During one of their visits, I casually mentioned to Ronald that I was thinking of meeting with an independent financial advisor to look over my portfolio. The warmth in Ronald's voice dropped by exactly 1 degree. Just one. But I was a woman who had spent 31 years watching the micro expressions on children's faces. I noticed. Then came the morning I walked into First Midwest Bank on Salem Avenue. I needed to ask about taking out a small $5,000 personal loan to replace the failing HVAC system in my house. The bank manager, a polite young man named Kevin, typed my name and my social security number into his computer. He looked at his screen. He looked up at me. He looked at his screen again, his brow furrowing deeply. "Ma'am," he said carefully, his voice dropping to a whisper, "you currently have a balance of $43 million in a private investment account under your name. Why would you need a $5,000 loan?" I sat very, very still. The fluorescent lights hummed loudly above us. Someone's phone rang sharply in the lobby behind me. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely working. Could you say that again?" Kevin turned his monitor around. There it was, $43,412,000, sitting in a massive trust account bearing my exact name and social security number. It had been opened in 2009 under the name Daniel R. Collins Trust. The sole beneficiary, Margaret A. Collins. Me. I asked Kevin if I could have a glass of water. He quickly brought it in a paper cup. I drank it slowly, trying to force my brain to think. Daniel had never mentioned this account. Not once in the 7 years between 2009 and his death. It wasn't in his financial folder. It wasn't in any document Ronald had ever shown me. I had handed Ronald administrative access to every single account I knew about. And somehow, this $43 million account had never, ever come up. Was that an accident? Could a financial professional simply forget a $43 million trust account? I drove home completely on autopilot. I walked inside, locked the door, and sat at my kitchen table. The exact same table where Cynthia had offered to help me 8 years ago. I put both hands flat on the wood and forced myself to breathe. My rose garden was visible through the back window, blooming nicely for June. Everything looked completely mockingly normal. Then I opened my laptop and I started adding things up. I am not an accountant, but I am a woman who balanced a household budget flawlessly for 30 years. And I am a woman who spent 3 decades teaching children that if a math problem doesn't add up, you go back and check your work. I pulled every single statement from Daniel's old folder. I logged into my online banking. I cross-referenced dates. I wrote the numbers down on a yellow legal pad in my neatest handwriting, exactly the way I wrote my daily lesson plans. By midnight, the picture was crystal clear, and it was incredibly ugly. From the modest accounts Ronald had managed over the last 8 years, approximately $380,000 had moved in ways I cannot explain. Strange, recurring transfers to entities I didn't recognize. Bizarre management fees that seemed entirely invented. Massive disbursements with absolutely no corresponding benefit to me. $380,000. Nearly 400 grand that should have been my retirement safety net, quietly and systematically siphoned off over 8 years. Ronald had moved the money in increments small enough that no single transaction ever triggered an alarm. I sat back in my chair and stared at the kitchen ceiling. And then, the most terrifying realization of all hit me. Ronald didn't know about the trust. If Ronald had known about the $43 million, he would have drained it dry years ago. Daniel had hidden it deliberately, it seemed. He had kept it sealed away with a specific beneficiary designation that quietly passed it to me outside of probate court. Ronald had stolen every single dime he could easily reach, but he had missed the massive treasure chest entirely. If I walked into my brother-in-law's house and confronted him tomorrow, I would be handing a greedy, desperate criminal a live grenade. I thought about calling the police. I thought about calling my estate lawyer, Patricia. I thought about calling my sister in Phoenix. What I actually did was close my laptop, go to bed, and stare at the dark for 4 hours. Fear is a strange thing. It doesn't always make you shrink. Sometimes it crystallizes you. Somewhere around 3 a.m., lying in Daniel's house, in Daniel's bed, thinking about Daniel's money that Ronald had spent on luxury ski lodges and Tuscan villas, I felt something massive shift inside me. The hollow, grieving woman who had blindly signed those papers in a fog 8 years ago was still in there somewhere, but she was no longer in charge. I thought to myself, Daniel left me this. He built it quietly, carefully over years, the exact same way he did everything. He never made a fuss. He just made absolute sure I would be okay. He left it to me, and I am going to keep it. The plan came together over the following week, and it was not dramatic. There were no wild schemes, no clever tricks, no movie moments. It was simply the plan of a careful, patient third-grade teacher who understood that the absolute best way to protect something fragile is to be very, very quiet about it. Step 1. Say absolutely nothing to Ronald. Not a hint, not a question, not a single probing remark about my finances. Our relationship would continue to look exactly as it always had. Step 2. Get proper, vicious legal representation. Not Patricia, who was perfectly fine for writing wills, but completely out of her depth for this. I needed a high-level financial fraud attorney. I needed a shark who handled exactly this kind of theft. Step 3. Document everything. Every missing transfer, every fake fee, every anomaly. Build the paper trail before doing anything else. Step 4. Secure the massive trust account. Move it, protect it, and make absolutely sure Ronald could never gain access to it if he somehow found out it existed. I wrote these 4 steps down on my yellow legal pad. Then I tore out the page, folded it twice, and tucked it inside my hardcover copy of To Kill a Mockingbird on the living room bookshelf. The absolute last place Ronald Collins would ever look. I made a pot of coffee. I went to school. I smiled warmly at my students. I had a plan. My best friend, Carol, found the attorney for me. His name was James Whitfield. I had sworn Carol to absolute secrecy over coffee at her kitchen table, speaking with a cold seriousness that genuinely shocked her. "Peggy," she had whispered, looking at my notes, "are you absolutely sure?" "I am sure," I replied. Whitfield's office was in a sleek professional building downtown. He was in his late 40s, unhurried, with reading glasses he deliberately took off and set on his desk before he spoke. I liked him immediately. I laid out everything. The bank manager's revelation of the trust account, the original folder, the yellow legal pad, the $380,000 in transfers I couldn't explain. Whitfield listened without interrupting a single time. Then he put his glasses back on and looked closely at my numbers. "Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice grave, "this is a major civil matter, and potentially a severe criminal one. But before we determine which path to take, I need certified official account records going back to 2016. Not your printed copies. Certified originals directly from the financial institutions. How do I get those without Ronald getting an alert?" I asked. "Because you are the primary account holder and the sole legal beneficiary of the trust. You have the absolute legal right to request complete records independently. Ronald has zero right to be notified of your request. Whitfield paused, looking at me intently. In fact, Mrs. Collins, he had no legal right to manage your accounts in the first place without a proper, court-ordered power of attorney, which, based on what you're describing, you never formally granted him. That landed hard. I had signed papers at a kitchen table while I was barely functioning, and whatever those papers actually said, they were almost certainly not what Ronald had cheerfully described them as. I left Whitfield's office with a list of certified record requests to file, and a quiet, burning fury that I kept very carefully off my face as I walked to my car. The requests went out that exact week. It took 11 days to receive the first batch, but in the meantime, something changed with Ronald. I don't know what triggered it. Perhaps he had noticed my appointment with the estate lawyer months ago and had been watching my movements since then. Perhaps it was pure paranoid instinct, the kind that criminals apparently develop to survive. But the Friday after I filed the secret record requests, my phone rang. "Peggy!" Ronald's voice boomed cheerfully through the speaker. "Just checking in. How are you doing, sweetheart?" He called me sweetheart approximately never. I sat very still on my porch, looking at my roses, and kept my voice perfectly warm and oblivious. "Oh, I'm just fine, Ronald. It's beautiful weather out here. The roses are coming in so nicely." "Good, good," he said, though he sounded slightly tense. "Hey, I've been meaning to come up and go over some of the account paperwork with you. Just routine maintenance, you know how it is. Maybe sometime next week. Of course," I smiled into the phone. "Anytime." I hung up. I sat with the roses and the late afternoon light, and the very clear, terrifying understanding that Ronald Collins was beginning to smell smoke. The certified banking records arrived in the mail on a Tuesday. I drove them straight to Whitfield's office without opening them. He spent 40 minutes reviewing them while I sat in the client chair, looking at the heavy diplomas on his wall. Then he turned to me. His expression was the professional, legal version of grim. "Mrs. Collins," he began softly, "I can now tell you with absolute confidence that between 2016 and 2024, approximately $412,000 was moved from accounts under your name. It was moved through a series of fake management fee assessments, bogus advisory charges, and direct cash transfers to a shell LLC registered in Ronald Collins's name. RC Financial Consulting, LLC. I stopped breathing. This LLC does not appear to have provided any actual services to you whatsoever, Whitfield continued. Furthermore, the transfers were structured incredibly carefully. They were never more than $9,000 in a single transaction, which suggests a highly deliberate effort to stay just below federal banking reporting thresholds. I heard him say it. I heard every single word clearly. "Is that a crime?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Structuring financial transfers to avoid federal reporting thresholds is a severe federal offense," he said flatly. "And that's before we even address the fraudulent misrepresentation of the contract you signed, which I believe was deliberately presented to you under false pretenses during a period of medically documented grief." The fluorescent light in his office buzzed softly. I sat very still. "What do I do now?" I asked. "Now," Whitfield said, leaning forward slightly, "we begin to build the trap. And you continue to give Ronald Collins absolutely no indication that anything has changed." I thought of the phone call. "The roses are coming in so nicely." I thought I'd done that part perfectly. "One more thing," Whitfield said urgently. "The $43 million trust account. We need to move it immediately. Not to a different bank, but into a heavily protected legal structure under your name alone, with zero secondary access possible. If Ronald discovers it exists before we strike, you want it behind a titanium wall he cannot touch." We began the transfer paperwork that exact afternoon. The point of no return, Whitfield told me later, was the moment I received those certified records. He was right. Up until that Tuesday, I could have told myself I had misremembered the numbers. I could have accepted Ronald's smooth explanations. I could have gone back to being the grieving, compliant widow at the kitchen table. But that version of me was dead and gone. Whitfield filed the massive civil fraud complaint on a Thursday morning in late July. Simultaneous with the filing, he sent a formal, devastating notification letter to Ronald Collins via certified mail. Registered delivery. Signature legally required. Ronald will know by Friday morning. Whitfield warned me. I spent Thursday evening in my garden. I pulled weeds until my knees ached, then sat on the porch steps with a glass of iced tea and listened to the neighborhood settle into the dark. I had just set a bomb in motion that could not be undone, and I sat with that fact the way you sit with a coming storm. Ronald called at 7:48 a.m. on Friday morning. I let it go straight to voicemail. Then, standing in my kitchen in my bathrobe, I played the message. His voice was tightly controlled. That was the first terrifying thing. Ronald was a man who became very, very controlled when he was cornered. "Peggy," he said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "I got a letter this morning from a lawyer that I think involves some kind of massive misunderstanding. I need you to call me back immediately. There are things you don't understand about how Daniel managed his money, and I don't want you getting bad advice from people who don't have your best interests at heart. Call me." I forwarded the voicemail directly to Whitfield. I did not call him back. Let me pause right here. What Ronald did next. Showing up at my house to threaten me. The explosive legal deposition that destroyed his lies and the final, crushing verdict from the federal government is something I will never forget. If you want to hear how I took Ronald to court and watched his entire criminal life collapse, let me know in the comments and I will release part 2. Until then, check your bank accounts and never sign a document you haven't read. Welcome back. If you listened to part 1, you know I had just uncovered a massive 8-year financial betrayal. While I was grieving my late husband, Daniel, his brother Ronald had quietly siphoned over $400,000 from my accounts. But Ronald had made one catastrophic mistake. He didn't know Daniel had secretly left me a protected $43 million trust account. My lawyer had just formally filed a massive civil fraud lawsuit against Ronald. And Ronald had just left a panicked, threatening voicemail on my phone. They came to my house the very next day, Saturday morning. I was in my garden when I heard Ronald's brand new truck pull up. He and his wife Cynthia came around the side gate without even knocking. That alone told me everything I needed to know about how they had decided to handle this. Cynthia was actually carrying a casserole dish covered in foil. The sheer audacity of it almost made me laugh. "Peggy," Ronald said, his voice a sickening mixture of warmth and wounded pride. "We need to talk." I kept my gardening gloves on. I didn't stand up from my knees. "You should have called first," I said. "We were worried about you," Cynthia cooed, setting the casserole on the porch railing like a prop. "We think someone has been feeding you some very wrong information. And my lawyer, Mr. Whitfield, handles all communication now," I interrupted smoothly. "You have his number." Ronald's composure slipped, just a tightening around the eyes, but I saw it. "Peggy, listen to me. If you proceed with this lawsuit, you are going to destroy this family. Daniel would be devastated. He trusted me with what?" I said. Dead silence. "With what, Ronald?" I asked again, looking directly into his eyes. "What exactly did Daniel trust you with? Say it clearly, please." "He didn't. Of course he didn't." Cynthia put her manicured hand on his arm, and I watched the two of them recalibrate in real time. "We can make this go away quietly," Ronald said finally, dropping the fake, wounded warmth entirely. His voice went flat and cold. "You don't understand what becomes public in a civil fraud case. Your name, Daniel's name, all of his business. Is that what you want? His legacy dragged through the mud?" "My lawyer will be in touch," I said. I stood up, picked up my gardening trowel, and walked inside. I locked the back door behind me. I heard them stand on the porch for another minute. Then I heard the truck start and speed away. I sat on the kitchen floor for a while, not because I was falling apart, but because the adrenaline was shaking my legs. After 8 years of being managed, handled, and gently deceived by these people, I had just looked Ronald Collins in the eyes and refused to move an inch. A few weeks later, Ronald's lawyer sent us a settlement offer. They offered me a one-time payment of $175,000, paid privately, in exchange for dismissing the lawsuit and signing a non-disclosure agreement. And, just to try and terrify me, they filed a counterclaim, arguing that the contract I signed 5 days after my husband's funeral gave them total legal authority to take my money. I looked at the settlement offer, $175,000 against over $400,000 stolen, against $43 million secured. Did they actually believe I was still that frightened, grieving widow? I emailed my lawyer exactly 3 words. Please decline it. That afternoon, I called my younger sister, Beverly, in Phoenix and told her everything. There was a long silence on the phone. Then Beverly simply said, "Peggy, I'm getting on a plane." Beverly was a retired nurse, precise, no nonsense, and fiercely protective. She arrived with a suitcase and a quiet, burning fury that I found incredibly sustaining. She read through the bank statements, looked at me, and said, "Ronald Collins sat at our father's Christmas table and ate our mother's cooking. He flew to Daniel's funeral and hugged you." "I know," Bev said. She stayed for a week. When she finally left, she held both my hands at the front door and said something I will never forget. "Daniel knew exactly what he was doing, Peggy. He left that massive account for you in secret because you are exactly the strong woman he knew you were." In September, Ronald and Cynthia tried one last desperate play. They called and begged for a sit-down in my living room. "Just family. No lawyers," Ronald pleaded. I agreed to let them come. But I didn't tell them that my best friend Carol would be sitting in the corner of the room the entire time. When Ronald walked in and saw a witness, his eyes flickered with panic. He hadn't planned for an audience. "We've been doing a lot of thinking," Ronald began, leaning forward with an earnest, practiced posture. "And Cynthia and I both know that in trying to help you, we may have made decisions that didn't look right. We should have been more transparent." Transparent. He had secretly funneled my money into a dummy LLC 41 separate times, and the word he chose was transparent. "We just don't want this for you, Peggy," Cynthia added, actually squeezing out a few fake tears. "All this stress, all this fighting in court. You deserve peace. We could figure this out between ourselves, quietly. Isn't that worth something to you?" She reached across the table to grab my hand. I pulled my hand away slowly. "I know you don't want this in court," I said. I stood up. "Whitfield's office will be in touch." The legal deposition took place on a Tuesday in October. It was held in a cold conference room downtown. A court reporter sat with her machine. My lawyer, Whitfield, sat beside me. Ronald and his high-priced defense attorney sat across the table. I sat at the absolute head of the table, because this was my case. I had prepared for this the way I prepared for parent-teacher conferences, thoroughly, specifically, and with the complete understanding that the person across from me would throw a tantrum, and I would need to be the calm adult in the room. Ronald's lawyer tried to argue that their consulting company, RC Financial, provided legitimate investment advice. Whitfield smiled. He opened a massive binder and methodically dismantled Ronald's entire life. First, Whitfield proved that RC Financial Consulting was formed just months before my husband died, and in its entire existence, it had never had a single other client. Its only income was the money stolen from me. Second, Whitfield brought out our forensic accountant's report. It proved that Ronald had made 41 separate cash transfers from my accounts, and every single transfer was meticulously kept just under the $10,000 federal banking reporting threshold. When Ronald's lawyer tried to argue that I had signed a contract agreeing to flexible management fees, Whitfield slid a piece of paper across the table. "Mr. Collins," Whitfield said smoothly. In a search of all communications between you and my client over the last 8 years, including emails, texts, and letters, there's not one single written communication regarding fees of any kind. You never disclosed them. Ronald stared at his lawyer. His lawyer stared at the table. Mr. Collins, Whitfield continued, going in for the kill. Did you ever disclose the existence of RC Financial Consulting to my client before she signed that document? Ronald shifted in his chair. He rubbed his face with his hands. I sat at the head of the table and watched a man realize in real time that his web of lies was collapsing. I don't believe it was mentioned by name, Ronald finally whispered. They immediately asked for a break. In the hallway, I watched Ronald staring at the ceiling, doing the panicked math of a man who knew he was going to lose everything. 2 days later, they came back with a new settlement offer. $280,000. Whitfield brought it to me. What do we do? I asked him. We decline it, Whitfield said softly. Because this morning, the U.S. Attorney's Office contacted me. They are opening a federal criminal investigation into Ronald for illegal financial structuring. If he's convicted, he's looking at federal prison time. The choice before me was clear. If I settled, I just got some money back. But Ronald was going to face federal criminal charges, regardless of what I did. Let it go to trial, I said. The civil trial lasted just 3 days in February. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, listened to our forensic accountant outline the theft. Then, she listened to me clearly and calmly explain how Ronald had exploited my grief 5 days after my husband's funeral. When Ronald took the stand, it was pathetic. He stumbled over dates. He couldn't name a single other client his firm had ever served. The judge's ruling was absolutely crushing. She awarded me the full recovery of the stolen $412,000, plus prejudgment interest, plus attorney's fees. And then she slapped Ronald with a massive $350,000 in punitive damages for willfully exploiting a vulnerable widow. The total judgment against him was just shy of $900,000, but the federal government moved much slower. In April, Ronald and Cynthia Collins were formally indicted on 3 federal counts each: wire fraud, bank fraud, and structuring financial transactions to evade reporting requirements. Facing decades in prison, they took a plea deal. In September, the gavel finally came down. Ronald was sentenced to 22 months in federal prison, plus 3 years of supervised release. Cynthia was sentenced to 18 months of supervised probation and slapped with a massive $95,000 fine. They were ordered to pay full restitution to me and the IRS. They had to sell their beautiful home in Columbus to cover the fines. Cynthia's social media accounts, with all those photos of Tuscany and Barbados, were quietly deleted. Ronald's professional licenses were permanently revoked. I wasn't in the courtroom when they were sentenced. I was at home in my garden, tending to the last of the autumn roses. I retired from teaching at the end of that school year. What I wanted most with my newfound wealth wasn't luxury or drama. It was simply time, quiet, and the absolute right to decide what each day would hold. The very first thing I did with the settlement money was pay to have my HVAC system replaced. The exact thing I had walked into the bank for in the first place. As the technician installed it, I just smiled. $5,000 had unlocked a life I didn't know I had. I set up a quiet scholarship at my elementary school in Daniel's name, providing college bonds for graduating 5th graders. Small, meaningful, exactly the right size. I expanded my backyard into a proper, stunning rose garden with a gravel path and a bench. I traveled to Portugal for 2 weeks by myself, drinking wine by the river and reading on terraces. I joined a master gardening class. What I found in the months after the trial wasn't just happiness. It was a profound lightness. I had doubted myself so thoroughly after Daniel died. I had handed over my judgment, my finances, and my certainty to monsters. But slowly, over 18 months of the hardest kind of fight, I had taken my power back. One afternoon, Sitting on the bench beneath the Japanese maple tree my sister and I had planted, I finally understood. Daniel knew exactly who I was. He built that $43 million account in secret and left it for me because he knew that when the time came, I would know exactly how to handle it. And he was right. I am 61 years old. I tend my garden. I remember Daniel every single day. And I sign absolutely nothing without reading the fine print first. What would you have done? If this story moved you, please share it, leave a comment, and let me know your thoughts. Thank you for listening. It means the world to me.